Okay, so fully automated luxury communism seeks to solve a lot of problems that capitalism subjects us to. In his 2019 book of the same name, the left political commentator Aaron Bastani outlines 5 crises that this left accelerationist utopia should solve, including climate change, resource scarcity, ever larger surplus populations, aging, and technological unemployment as a result of automation. But Bastani, along with Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams, who are the authors of Inventing the Future, that's a 2015 book that puts forward a similar vision, are particularly concerned, I think, with another crisis that isn't listed here. And this is a challenge that frames their political project as a whole, namely the lack of visionary optimism on the contemporary left. FALC seeks to restore this optimism with a set of long-term goals for a radically different society that is post-work, post-scarcity, but also importantly avoids ecological breakdown. Bastani declares FALC must be a green politics of ecology as well as a red politics of shared wealth. And Cernicek and Williams also speak to the potential of red-green coalitions mobilizing together around a post-work politics. But despite this apparent desire for a common red-green political project, left political ecology and left ecological economics do not play much of a role in either of these books. Instead, they're typically condensed into a rhetorically useful figure of pessimistic antagonist, so the antithesis of FALC, which only serves to underline the radical optimism, basically, of left accelerationism. So for Bastani, left-green politics, with its idea of growth having limits, and that the answer to climate change is consuming less energy, is equivalent to him as a downsizing in life. It's something that he says, quote, just feels wrong. For Cernicek and Williams, the idea of sacrificing what we consider to be abundance for ecological freedom can only be a primitivist dystopia or the austere life promised by anti-modernists. FALC, with its red techno-optimism, is surrounded by a wall of hope. Everyone located outside this wall tends to look like a pessimist, including its would-be green allies. Rather than integrating green critiques, this wall of optimism usually works to deflect ecological objections in a way that only makes FALC's position stronger. It is extraordinarily difficult to critique the feasibility of FALC from an eco-economic perspective without landing in this role of pessimist. Or someone who basically looks like you have no faith in the ingenuity of humankind and its capacity to innovate its way out of catastrophic conditions. This is more or less the position we find ourselves in if we attempt to reconcile Inventing the Future or fully automated luxury communism with a report that was released this year by the European Environmental Bureau. So with this report, an underlying assumption upon which the feasibility of FALC and achieving it before ecological breakdown depends is dealt a pretty serious blow. This is the claim that it's possible to increase production and consumption and the economic growth that they drive while also decreasing resource use and pressure on the environment. Throughout history, economic growth has been accompanied by a proportional increase in ecological destruction. Bastani, Cernicek, and Williams, all citing capitalism as the main driver of the climate crisis, would agree here. But the hope is that through technological progress, we can achieve not only relative decoupling, which is indicated here in this diagram. This is where growing production and consumption lead to a proportionally lower but still increasing level of resource use and environmental impact. But the ultimate goal is then to reach absolute decoupling, which is where eco-efficiency allows us to increase economic growth while simultaneously decreasing resource use and environmental impact. And all of this needs to happen on a global level. It needs to happen permanently. It needs to happen sufficiently fast, that is, before total ecological collapse. And it also needs to happen in an equitable way that doesn't require the exploitation of certain countries for the benefit of others. So absolute, global, rapid, permanent, and just eco-economic decoupling is a ubiquitous idea. It's an official goal of the OECD, the European Commission, the UN's Environment Programme, and the World Bank. So this seemingly unanimous support for decoupling might explain why neither Cernicek and Williams nor Bastani mention it as one of the premises on which the project of FALC depends. But I hope to show in what follows that FALC's long-term vision for a post-work, post-scarcity society that secures luxury for all in a way that relies on high production and high consumption and increasing economic growth while also preventing ecological breakdown is something that wouldn't be possible unless we also assume decoupling can happen. The thing is that there is no empirical evidence of this process that it can occur. So as the EEB report, which is titled Decoupling Debunked, demonstrates with an extensive literature review, there are actually only a handful of examples of relative decoupling. There's even less examples of absolute decoupling, and these are only temporary or local anyway, and usually followed by recoupling. In all the reviewed case studies, the reduction of environmental pressures falls dramatically short of current environmental policy targets. And so while some argue that there remains nevertheless a theoretical possibility of absolute decoupling, the EEB report also identifies 7 factors that make this a very, very slim possibility. If FALC, or for that matter, any other left utopian vision is to be taken seriously, it would ideally reflect on what these factors mean for its promises of social and ecological redemption through its proposed technological changes together with continuing economic growth. So what are these factors and how do they sit with FALC's proposed transformational pathways towards luxury communism? I want to start by looking at these 4: problem shifting, rising energy expenditure, rebound effects, and cost shifting. So problem shifting refers to the way in which technological solutions to environmental problems typically exacerbate other environmental problems or actually create new ones entirely. This is the case with renewable energy sources, which on one hand allow us to reduce our reliance on polluting fossil fuels, but in doing so increase our land use for solar farms and biofuels. They may also lead to water conflicts in the case of hydropower, to pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in the construction of the necessary infrastructure, and increases in mining for rare earth minerals that are required for wind power, electric vehicles, solar, and also the infrastructure of nuclear energy plants. Not to mention for energy storage and the information technologies needed to operate and increase the efficiency of these renewable energy systems. So all of this in turn will lead to biodiversity loss and possibly the displacement of people on the extraction frontier. So these are all forms of environmental pressure that will increase as we increase production and consumption under a green capitalism, but likely under FALC too. FALC promises us a world of unlimited renewable energy to fuel the presumably massive demands of fully automated economies and the luxury goods and services that are to be made available to all. Already, reporting is emerging on the destructive impacts of renewable energy and its dirty supply chains, which are rife with human rights abuses, while studies forecast that rare mineral extraction will need to increase violently if we are to achieve an energy transition while still attempting to grow the world's economies at the same time. Grasping these issues, Bastani proposes asteroid mining, which in itself, I think, is another form of shifting the problem. Space flight also creates its own environmental pressures. Rocket launches release significant amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, as do re-entries, in addition to the emissions and resource use of the infrastructure for space mining activities here on Earth. And there's also the under-research effects of rocket launches on the ozone layer. Okay, cool. So now I want to talk about rising energy expenditure, and this is a factor that's particularly important to consider in light of FALC's promise for unlimited energy. So in resource extraction in general, usually the cheapest available sources are extracted first. As an economy grows, demand for these resources rises, but then the cost of extraction also grows as commodity frontiers now have to move to places where it's increasingly difficult, energy and labor intensive and expensive to mine. This applies to the extraction for the energy sources themselves, but also for the material required to construct technology to capture this energy. So while Bastani argues that all trends point towards lowering costs and increasing efficiency of accessing renewable energy, we might instead end up in a vicious cycle of increasing energy expenditure in the growth economy of FALC. If economic growth requires more energy and more material, and it takes increasingly more energy and material to extract this energy material, then rising energy expenditure acts as a kind of limit to growth and does present a major barrier to decoupling, as this vicious cycle will just dramatically increase environmental pressure. So in order to argue that decoupling is possible, the EEB report reminds us one must show how you would deal with this increasing marginal cost of energy and material extraction. And so this applies not only to capitalist advocates of green growth, but also for left accelerationists like Bastani, Sonacek, and Williams. Okay, so even if we do make gains in resource efficiency through these technologies under FALC, another factor comes into play that its proponents should also engage with, and this is rebound effects. This is where technological improvements lead to efficiency initially. This efficiency encourages high levels of production and consumption that were not previously possible. But then you end up with ultimately higher levels of production and consumption that end up being quite inefficient or overuse. So these effects can be direct, where we consume and produce more of the same product or service after it becomes more efficient. So if you have an eco-efficient car, you drive it more. Or it can be indirect, where resources freed up by the efficiency are then reinvested into something else. So we might save money from driving an eco-friendly car and then spend that money on a long-haul flight to a holiday destination. There are also economy-wide rebound effects, where eco-efficient cars just reinforce the overall dominance of car travel over more sustainable modes of transportation like trains and bikes. This reinforces the way that cities themselves are designed then to privilege this mode of transport. So as the rebound effect swallows up the initial efficiency gains made, they can dramatically slow down decoupling of economic growth from environmental impact, but they can also reverse it altogether. So under FALC, lowering costs of solar energy will mean that we can increase our energy use to luxury levels, but then you have to ask, how long would it take until this increase swamps the efficiency initially gained from renewable energies, and how long would it take until it becomes quite deeply inefficient, recoupling then to intensive resource use and environmental pressure again. Also, the efficiency gains achieved by automation mean we can work less if we want. We can then spend our time and income on luxury goods and services. These might also be potentially resource intensive and come with a high environmental impact, and studies show that usually when people have more time, it is likely that they spend it on high environmental impact activities. But Bastani does not really see a problem here, and instead feels comfortable with promising a fully automated green communism where we will, quote, travel more, enjoy crops and foodstuffs from other parts of the planet, but also see the great feats of humanity and the beauty of Earth, and this will be the birthright of all to do this. The question is just then how much of Earth will be left after humanity's feats. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is this problem of cost shifting. So a lot of examples that purport to be examples of decoupling are actually examples of burden shifting. We can also call this virtual decoupling, or it's been described by the Marxist geographer David Harvey as a spatial fix. So today, globalization allows high-income countries to reduce environmentally destructive activities within their own boundaries while still taking advantages of the results of these activities, so manufacturing, resource extraction, industrial agriculture, waste processing, and so on, when they're taken over by low-income countries with less strict regulations. And this is very similar to the way in which rich nations also rely on cheap labor costs in these same low-income nations. This creates what we can call an ecologically unequal exchange, and it can systematically deteriorate a country's resources, independence, and development potential, all while still fueling global climate breakdown. Technological innovation in this way does not always just reflect human ingenuity, but the successful appropriation and displacement of both labor and environmental burdens. The EB report asks us to consider global capitalism as a system in which one country's environmental problems are typically the flip side to another country's growth. In the same way, we should also ask, what do we do to ensure that the technological innovations of capitalism, which FALC would then seize control over, are also not the flip side of exploitation and ecological destruction taking place elsewhere, out of sight, out of mind? This question, I think, would ideally be the first problem that's tackled by any proposal for FALC, particularly as its immediate solution for the climate crisis, namely renewable energy, already conforms to this dynamic as Western industries rapidly offshore the production of rare metals and its associated pollution, and also with artificial intelligence, which the proposals for automation rely on, similarly take place offshore, and they're also highly emitting. Like training a single AI model is now understood to be produce 5 times the lifetime emissions of an average car. And yeah, I think there's also more reports about this cheap overseas labor, also where call center workers have to pretend to do the work of the actual AI. So, but far from offering a sustained engagement with this issue, Senechek and Williams just acknowledge the complex nature of capitalism's crises and its global nature, but then limit their own analysis largely to Western capitalist democracies, quoting, leaving aside the immense but immensely important regions of the rest of the world. Bastani does attempt to integrate the question of inequality between the global north and south in his book, but he then falls into the same trap of colonial developmentalist logic that Srnicek and Williams probably hoped to avoid in limiting their scope so severely. According to Bastani, the energy transition under FALC will mean that the global south will enjoy the most abundant and cheapest energy anywhere on Earth. But does this then guarantee that these countries will wield more power in their relationships with the global north? Or will they simply become ideal sites for offshoring, extraction, pollution, also biodiversity loss and land grabs to make way for solar farms and fully automated industrial agriculture? So then through a redistributive global carbon tax, FALC would fund, to use Bastani's phrase, technological catch-up, supplying low-tech energy solutions to these developing nations as reparations for historic injustice. Never mind the fact that attempts to assist these same nations to, quote, catch up in their industrial and technological progress to the standards of Western nations is the same narrative basically that justified their underdevelopment and exploitation by the global development industry in the last century and also previously. Okay. So if we were to see new defenses of FALC that respond to these four factors, we could anticipate them then to appeal to two further arguments for decoupling that are currently being used by advocates for green growth under capitalism. And these are recycling in the circular economy and also the potential to dematerialize economies by shifting them away from polluting industries like agriculture, manufacturing, mining, and so on, towards immaterial industries like the creative, knowledge, and service economy. These would all be likely important components of a would-be luxury communist economy, whether they can be automated or not. So there's a lot of promise seen in the idea of the circular economy, which is where the linear process of production would be turned into a closed loop with zero waste, as materials used to produce these new products are drawn just from discarded old ones. And in this way, it would reduce the need, ideally, for intensive extraction. However, there are hard limits to the circularity that a pro-growth economy, whether it's under capitalism or under luxury communism, could achieve, and it would approach these limits rapidly. This is for three reasons. Firstly, recycling rates are very, very low and only slowly increasing. It's unlikely that they would speed up in time. Secondly, recycling processing itself is resource intensive. It comes with high environmental pressure and its own use of energy and raw minerals. Finally, it's a mathematical impossibility to have a circular economy that can match rates of replacement if consumption is always increasing. So in a growing economy, recycling will always be too far behind to actually close the loop and end extraction. This is something to keep in mind if left accelerationist or eco-modernist arguments for a fully automated luxury communist circular economy emerge at some point. I think it's also pretty likely that we would see an argument emerging for a dematerialized, fully automated luxury service economy. So this would be where luxury isn't something that you gain through high impact consumer goods, but more something through what people like to call experience. So through consuming experiences, going to restaurants, attending high scale events, travel, immersive entertainment platforms, and so on. Advocates of green growth claim that we can still grow our economies without heavy environmental impact if our economies are focused on growing and producing immaterial things in these tertiary sectors of service, so creativity and knowledge production as well. But these sectors are just as tightly coupled to environmental impact as manufacturing, agriculture, and extraction. A service economy of luxury experience necessarily exists on top of and also depends on these high pollution and energy and resource intensive industries. Moreover, the service economy itself fuels high energy and resource demand. A recent Greenpeace report shows that if the cloud were a country, it would have the 5th largest electricity demand in the world. And the EEB report also offers some interesting statistics. One that I really like is about the energy consumption of a Second Life avatar, which is on average 1,752 kilowatts per year. And then this is a lot if you think about the world average for human energy use is 2,436, so it's kind of close. So even if these not so immaterial sectors were able to be powered by renewable energy under FALC, this still creates an array of problems and leads to heavy environmental pressure for the 4 reasons that we just discussed. So the final factor from the EEB report on decoupling that I'd like to think about FALC with is what they call insufficient and inappropriate technological change. So Bastani, Senechek, and Williams lean heavily on passages from Marx to frame their left techno-utopianism, drawing on his reflections on capitalism's dynamism, its ability to unlock human potential, and this kind of Promethean sentiment that unfolds from these remarks. But just as Marx himself revised these ideas in his later ecological notebooks, coming to an understanding that no matter how much we achieve through technological innovation, our economies are defined by hard ecological limits, and they must be organized accordingly, we should also then take the opportunity to think through FALC's ideas about technological change. So the scientists behind this report argue that technological change may not be enough for us right now for 3 reasons. So firstly, the way that technology develops does not target the factors of production that matter for ecological sustainability. And accordingly, they do not lead to innovations that reduce environmental pressures in a sufficient way. So as we saw, technological fixes do lead to problem shifting, cost shifting, rebound effects, and rising energy expenditure. And so this is the case with the innovations of green capitalism, but also the innovations as they're proposed under the banner of FALC. Secondly, in spite of the popular narratives of human advancement and then the related narratives of progress that are developed by Bastani, Senechek, and Williams, technology may not be disruptive enough in the changes that it triggers, often failing to displace other undesirable technologies. Finally, technological development is realistically not fast enough to enable a decoupling that is absolute, global, permanent, large, and sufficiently rapid to prevent ecological breakdown. And we see this being dealt with in an interesting way in Bastani's writing, where time is very elastic. In Fully Automated Luxury Communism, the book, we are moving deeper into the crises of capitalism at an incredible pace, but then the pace of technological advancement is just as equally impressive. With the aid of soft laws of progress that are more favored by entrepreneurs or management gurus than economics or science and technology studies, we can usually forecast that this advancement will only get faster. But at the same time, Bastani is seemingly willing to manipulate his and his readers' sense of time for technology. So whether it's for AI-driven automation or the development of meat alternatives or of genetic solutions to inherited illness, we are always not there yet, as a few crucial pieces from the puzzle are usually missing. But then these technologies are always simultaneously around the corner. The EEB report does not seek to argue against innovation in itself, but it does emphasize that technological solutions are deeply uncertain, arguably too uncertain to rely on given the gravity of the ecological situation that we find ourselves in. Moreover, technology is deeply ambivalent, bringing significant risk and unpredictable effects. So Bastani, Senechek, and Williams also acknowledge this fundamentally ambivalent nature of technological change. Bastani writes, "There is no reason why any of the above goals should liberate us or maintain our planet's ecosystems any more than they should lead to ever-widening income inequality and widespread collapse. For this reason, the latter chapters of both Inventing the Future and Fully Automated Luxury Communism outline a series of near-term political proposals, and these are designed to wrest control of politics away from neoliberalism in order to create the conditions that might be more conducive to a more democratic and socially environmentally just application of these technologies in the long term. But as we've seen, so long as FALC retains high levels of production, consumption, and economic growth as part of its long-term vision in pursuit of absolute decoupling, it doesn't seem likely that social or environmental justice will ever arrive. FALC hopes to create a world of abundance where we are no longer constrained by social or ecological limits to growth. But what is more likely is that we will accelerate until we hit these social and ecological limits extremely hard with no way to bounce back. This then is the pessimistic, but I also think realistic conclusion that we have to draw when we think about FALC through this emerging consensus on whether decoupling is actually possible and whether green growth by extension is possible. Okay, so one option does remain, and that can make us less pessimistic. And this has to do with abandoning the goal of continuous economic growth, reducing energy demand and environmental pressure by downscaling production and consumption in the global north. This is not a fringe or extreme position, as Bastani and Sonchek and Williams might have you believe, but it's a mode of tackling the climate crisis without relying heavily on the promise of decoupling or on carbon capture technologies, which come with their own uncertainties, while also restoring social and ecological justice to the global north and south. Downscaling, production and consumption has for decades been the subject of international research and activism in the degrowth movement. It has informed an exemplary scenario for climate mitigation in a 2018 IPCC report, and these alternatives will also be explored in the upcoming report this year. Several other studies have shown that a low energy demand scenario is the only one in which we can transition safely and rapidly enough to renewable energy. Despite this, Bastani and Sonchek and Williams seem to have little hope not only for the kind of life that we could live in a downscaled economy, as we saw at the outset of the talk from their remarks, but they also seem to consider downscaling not politically or rhetorically viable because it just doesn't feature in their vision at all. There is little by way of a language for downscaling in FALC. There is no framing for critically changing our relationship to technology, consumption, and production, other than repurposing and seizing the means. And not much space is given within this accelerationist image to consider downscaling as an option ultimately. The reasons for this rejection of downscaling consumption and production on this more rhetorical, explicit level are something that I'll be exploring in a subsequent talk, trying to place it in context with how accelerationism developed as a philosophical and political project. But I think at this point we can make the case that FALC's long-term vision for the future and the way that it brands itself as a utopian movement reveal a deeper pessimism about the possibility of downscaling production and consumption. So you could say that they're so pessimistic about it that they would prefer to construct the messaging of their politics around bets on technology that seek to bend the rules of nature with no inherent guarantees of good social or ecological outcomes, rather than to build a future utopia around an optimistic faith in the human capacity to turn its innovative capacities inwards, one in which we would radically and collectively change the rules and patterns of the economies that we ourselves have built. So if left accelerations are, for the time being, unable to come up with a reasonable guarantee for eco-economic decoupling under the world of FALC, it might become necessary for them to engage with this possibility of downscaling. So this is a shift in which they would have to ask themselves what is then more important. So it's either, I think, staying true to the kind of elegant theoretical maneuver, which is at the heart of accelerationism, in which the idea of going through capitalism rather than attempting to stand outside it and attack the mechanisms by which it operates. One of these mechanisms being unchecked economic growth, without which capitalism cannot survive. Or it's maybe a choice of being willing, as we accelerate towards climate breakdown, to then engage with the material and ecological realities of growth economies and the emerging scientific consensus on them, and then to rigorously consider what the acceleration of everything, even when it is wielded by a socialism or communism, would mean in practice. And would the resulting revised utopia still be FALC, or would it be something else? I'm personally optimistic that this choice will be explored in future work by those still partial to left accelerationism and left eco-modernism. But even as FALC still explicitly rejects the possibility of downscaling, there does remain space for productive dialogue between FALC and the degrowth movement. And this space has actually been carved out by Bastani, Sonchek, and Williams themselves in their implicit embrace of transformational pathways for a post-work, post-scarcity society that might also lead to a post-growth society. So we find these traces of an emergent post-growth politics and the near-term political proposals put forward in inventing the future in fully automated luxury communism, which stand in contrast with the long-term visions of technological acceleration that these near-term changes are meant to facilitate. So while the long-term proposals foregrounded in FALC, from automation to bioengineered foods, attempt to solve the problem of resource scarcity by doing more, producing more, extracting more, these near-term proposals take a different approach to solving the problem of scarcity by doing away with the logic of economic growth and taking the first steps towards a very different kind of abundance. One of these policies is Bastani's call to move beyond GDP growth as a metric of human flourishing. Measuring GDP growth effectively disguises social and ecological injustice, from environmental degradation to the different forms of poverty that such economic growth is usually accompanied by, from deteriorating conditions for the working poor, homelessness, and youth unemployment. GDP growth is, in other words, not equivalent to expanding levels of well-being. Bastani proposes that we measure human flourishing with what he calls an abundance index. This index would integrate CO2 emissions, energy efficiency, leisure time, health, lifespan, and self-reported happiness, and it would be adapted to regional and cultural differences. This is an important first step towards challenging arguments for pursuing economic growth in the hope that well-being will somehow trickle down. Leaving behind the pursuit of GDP growth is also part of a broader project of revitalizing and shifting the field of economics in policy, in education, in universities, and for the wider public. This is something that Seneček and Williams advocate for explicitly, pointing to examples of organizations that are pushing economics today to become more open and pluralistic, embracing decolonial, leftist, feminist, and ecological perspectives. All of these perspectives bring valuable challenges to the ideology of economic growth, which reinforces and is reinforced by orthodox economics theory, teaching, and research today. While Seneček and Williams are mostly dismissive of attempts to increasingly localize economies, Bastani embraces the value of such strategies in his call for municipalism, based on the success of the Preston model, which is named after a UK town and kind of success story for localization. Municipalism entails a shift towards supporting financially and politically local, cooperative, worker-owned businesses rather than favoring multinationals and industry giants that seek to maximize shareholder value above all else. So rather than seeking to fuel economic growth, a radical municipalism would be geared towards improving the well-being of these smaller communities by taking a downscaling approach where an abundant world beyond scarcity can be achieved not through ever greater production and consumption, but through community solidarity and collective sufficiency. This proposal dovetails with the development of local banks to support municipal projects, which would then fund organizations that specifically aim to improve ecological and social conditions rather than just maximizing profit. Both Bastani and Seneček and Williams also seek to develop a contemporary left conception of the universal basic income. So for Seneček and Williams, minimum income for all must work as a supplement to a stronger welfare state, and then Bastani integrates this into the framing of UBI by proposing universal basic services. These proposals similarly reorient the economy away from economic growth above all else and towards equality and well-being, and moreover directly challenge the profit-seeking privatization of public services, seeking to reverse this process. It's also worth paying close attention to how coy Bastani is when it comes to his promises of luxury. He writes, quote, "Under FALC we will see more of the world than ever before, eat varieties of food we have never heard of, and lead lives equivalent, if we so wish, to those of today's billionaires." I think this "if we so wish" part is important. Under FALC, the meaning of life is, Bastani says, for you to decide. And so while alluring visions of luxury play an important role rhetorically in the persuasive communication of FALC, in passing, Bastani does attempt to distinguish consumption under capitalism with its ubiquitous advertising and built-in obsolescence that both incentivize us to consume more and support economic growth from what consumption would be under FALC. Consumption under FALC is informed again by a different kind of abundance, where we simply have the resources needed to make us happy, but also a sense of common purpose, he says. The question is then, how much do we need to be happy? Though Bastani rails against the small is beautiful mantra as a kind of marker of bourgeois primitivism, if we don't need very much to be happy, and if it is our choice, if we're happy not living the lives of billionaires, then it seems like there is actually scope for downscaling consumption in his utopian vision, which in subtle ways places more importance not on fulfilling all our wants and wildest dreams, but making sure people have all their basic needs met in a society that is structured around well-being and not profit. Seneček and Williams similarly leave these kind of openings for the possibility of downscaling consumption, and they appear fleetingly throughout Inventing the Future. Interestingly, they point to the benefits of a post-work society as one that can, in itself, lead to significant reductions in energy consumption as well as a reduction in the convenience goods that are bought to fit our hectic work schedule. They argue that a post-work society need not lead to further mindless consumption, and instead advocate for a world that fulfills not only, that doesn't try to fulfill commodified wants, but leads to the extension and differentiation of needs as a whole, to use their phrasing. So So here too, we see a possibility space for a positive conception of downscaling consumption, even among these vocal left accelerationists. So for those who are interested in these near-term policy proposals by Bastani, Senachik, and Williams, but aren't sure about the ecological feasibility of their fully automated luxury, then it's probably worth taking a look at the ways in which researchers and activists in the degrowth movement have collaborated on expanding these first steps with further proposals to augment these policies and create positive feedback loops between them. And also there's a lot of research and debate around the risks and challenges that we would face in implementing them successfully. So in terms of going beyond GDP growth, a number of alternative indexes are already being researched and developed in the degrowth movement that are similar to Bastani's abundance index, but they also go beyond this in terms of considering all the different factors that should be included, how to best measure these in different contexts, and also the strategic and political implications for different countries that might seek to implement them. In terms of pluralizing the field of economics, this is something that the degrowth movement has actively done for a very long time, with many researchers also involved in building networks among heterodox economics programs, institutes, and students, and facilitating projects for making ecological economics more accessible to the broader public. Degrowth economics itself is a rich field with a wider aim of rethinking entire financial and monetary system, with proposals that range from citizen debt audits to proposals that integrate work from modern monetary theory and sovereign money, as well as restricting the power that speculative finance currently wields, and research into the potential of local currencies. So there are also a couple interesting local currency pilot projects underway, and these are part of municipalizing projects, which in the degrowth movement also go beyond just supporting the development of local worker-owned businesses, and then they go further to looking to support existing efforts as part of the solidarity economy movement, care economy, and commoning movements that all serve to start the transition to a post-growth, well-being centered economy today at the local level. While Bastani proposes the full automation of agriculture and bioengineering meat substitutes as an eco-efficient alternative to our current food system, degrowth recognizes that industrial-scale monoculture, agronomy, wasteful supply chains, and exploitative business models are in fact the major barrier that we need to tackle, and propose the development of local food chains, practices from agroecology, smallholder farming that facilitate carbon capture, as well as sophisticated land stewardship practices, and trying to learn from them as they've been practiced by indigenous groups around the world. And then basically trying to see these as forms of innovation themselves, and ones that are better positioned to solve the twin crises of climate breakdown and our dysfunctional food systems. UBI and UBS are also discussed in the degrowth movement, but the debate again goes beyond this, with further proposals for not only minimum income, but ways to cap maximum income and also inheritance caps, as well as other ways to achieve the redistribution of wealth through taxation. While Bastani, Senachik, and Williams tentatively recognize the importance of moving beyond the consumer culture created by capitalism, degrowth actually seeks to start this massive cultural shift not after we have achieved our utopia, but now. So acknowledging that narratives for alternatives to growth economies will be vital in the fight to gain support against neoliberal capitalism, degrowth then proposes radical shifts such as abolishing advertising that manipulates us into consuming more, but it also seeks out collaborations with artists and designers to find new ways to visualize what a post-growth life could be like beyond neoliberal individualism. Finally, while Senachik and Williams note the positive social and ecological benefits of reducing the working week and passing, policies of working time reduction are actually central to degrowth. Working less means less production, less consumption, and so the idea is basically that you could have a post-work world without automation. You would just reduce the amount of work that everybody does. Additional policies include supporting work-sharing arrangements, as well as programs to help workers in high environmental impact industries to transition to new, more rewarding roles, and providing them with the necessary training and support networks. So in both these near-term proposals by Bastani, Senachik, and Williams, and in the wide range of proposals being developed in degrowth, we see an alignment in the type of planetary scale change that both place as a first priority. So while the second group of proposals by Bastani, Senachek, and Williams do play more of a minor role in the communication, rhetoric, and overall framing of FALC, they are also the policies that are most important in that they need to happen first. They are the necessary conditions for any meaningful political change. So they have a kind of chronological political priority, in other words, over things like full automation. So while for degrowth, these proposals that work towards a post-growth world are not just means for a better future in the long term, but they're also ends in themselves, I do think that both groups have a common understanding of what the biggest design problems are for our world today. So here I've got a diagram which is often used in ecological economics to, among other things, visualize the relationship between ecological and economic systems. The economy does not sit side by side or even just intersect with ecology, but it is part of it, it is inside of it. And understanding the economy's position in this way, it gives us a new way to think about the word terraforming. So in restructuring the economy, we are modifying and collectively reshaping an integral part of the Earth's biosphere. This is a kind of highly focused and realistic terraforming, you could say, that rather than seeking to bend the laws of nature and augment our already severely strained planet as a whole, it instead seeks to zero in on this part of the global ecology that we as humans have built and are responsible for. The sophistication of this approach lies in the ability to facilitate better forms of interaction between the economy and ecology that surround it. But it's also strengthened by the wisdom that making our planet habitable in the future means making our economies habitable first, So the allure of eco-economic decoupling as an idea is very strong, and it might take a while for the left to accept that it represents an impossibility and one that distracts from the real task at hand of building habitable economies. Just as forces mobilized around climate denial, we can anticipate to see voices from across the political spectrum denying the impossibility of decoupling. And this is a narrative that is equally dangerous in its risk of feeding climate inertia. But if we do want to build the red-green alliance that Bastani, Senachek, and Williams do hope for, then it is vital that we find now some common ground between utopian economic futures rather than isolating left utopian thinkers within their different camps, shaped by borders informed more by aesthetic, theoretical, or strategic messaging preferences rather than the desires to reconcile a growing body of knowledge about the relationship between economy and ecology, with their visions for a post-work, post-scarcity future. In light of these emerging alignments that we've seen in their approaches to transforming our economies now, I do feel hopeful about the opportunities for more productive discussion between FALC and the degrowth movement.